Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to this deep dive. We're tackling a specific chapter from the book Imara, Gospel-Centered Missions to Muslims.
That's right. Chapter 15, called Confrontation.
And right away, this chapter dives into what it means by confrontation in this context.
Yeah, it positions it as a gospel bridge, but it's careful to distinguish it from apologetics, defending beliefs. This is more about polemics.
Polemics. So, like going on the offense, challenging beliefs directly.
Exactly. The source argues the goal is actually to create doubt about Islamic beliefs in the listener's mind.
Create doubt.
Okay.
And why do that?
Well, the idea presented is that creating that space, that doubt, opens up an opportunity for them to genuinely consider the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Makes sense. And who is this approach mainly aimed at, according to the source?
It notes that this specific approach, this confrontation of core beliefs, is seen as potentially most useful when engaging with Orthodox Muslims.
Orthodox Muslims. So those who hold quite strongly to traditional teachings, maybe know the history and texts more.
Precisely. People who might be more invested in the kinds of historical and textual claims the source wants to challenge.
Gotcha. Though the source does flag potential downsides too, right? It doesn't sound like an easy path.
Not at all. It mentions significant risks, things like causing confusion, possibly provoking retaliation, even leading to persecution for the person you're talking to.
Wow. It even brings up Paul's ministry causing riots in Ephesus as an example.
Right. So there's a really strong emphasis from the get-go on needing extreme care. You need to consider the environment, know the individual.
And make sure any trouble faced is for Christ, not just from being, reckless or foolish.
Exactly. Suffer for Christ, not foolishness, is how it's put. It definitely sets a high bar for discernment.
Okay. So how does the chapter structure this argument then?
Well, it lays out a framework. First, it argues for a biblical basis for this kind of confrontation. Then it gets into specific historical and textual problems it claims exist within Islam. And finally, it offers practical advice on how to actually do this carefully and importantly with love.
Right. Let's start with that first piece, the biblical foundation. Where does the source see support for polemics in the Bible? It looks at Jesus first.
Yes, it points straight to Jesus. It highlights instances where he used really, really strong language toward the religious leaders of his day.
Like what?
Things like calling them blind fools, hypocrites, even whitewashed tombs.
That's pretty direct, suggesting outer cleanliness but inner decay, right?
Exactly. Pretty stark imagery. And it wasn't just words either.
You mean his actions, like overturning the money changers' tables in the temple.
Precisely. The source argues that wasn't just a mild telling off. It was a direct, very public confrontation against what he saw as corruption in a sacred space.
Okay. And his followers. Did they adopt this style?
Well, John the Baptist is mentioned. He called the Pharisees and Sadducees a brood of vipers.
Another intense image, but basically calling them children of snakes.
Yeah, implying danger and deception. But the source really focuses on the Apostle Paul as someone who exemplified this approach in his ministry.
Because he'd often go into synagogues and debate.
That's the idea. The source points to passages in Acts, like Acts 13, 17, 18, 19, showing Paul going into Jewish centers and reasoning from the scriptures.
Which often involved challenging their interpretations.
Right. Challenging existing ideas about the Messiah, God, the law. It was direct engagement.
And there's that verse in 2 Corinthians 10.5 about destroying arguments.
Yes, the source interprets, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ as a mandate for intellectual confrontation.
So, identifying and challenging beliefs that clash with God's truth.
That's how it's framed. It also looks at Paul engaging pagan beliefs, like in Ephesus saying, gods made by human hands are no gods at all.
Or Athens using their altar to the unknown God to talk about the true God.
Exactly. Using their own context to confront and present an alternative. The source even suggests Paul likely studied these other belief systems.
Why? To understand them better.
Yeah, so he could effectively address their specific claims and then point towards the gospel.
Okay, so the argument is, Jesus and Paul provide a clear New Testament precedent for this kind of direct, even confrontational engagement with beliefs deemed false.
That's the case. The source builds for the biblical basis, yes.
Right. So, having laid that foundation, the chapter then moves into presenting the specific arguments it suggests using to challenge the standard Islamic narrative.
It does. And it organizes these arguments around potential problems with, as it calls them, the place, Mecca, the book, the Quran, and the man, Muhammad.
And these are presented as historical and textual issues.
Yes. The source acknowledges these things take time to study, but it asserts that, based on the evidence it cites, many common beliefs about Islam's origins don't align with historical and archaeological findings.
Okay, let's dig into that. Starting with the place, Mecca. What specific claims does the source make?
Well, it raises issues with some geographical references in the Quran itself. It claims, for instance, the Quran seems to place Mecca near Sodom and Gomorrah.
Which are historically much further north.
Right. Hundreds of kilometers away, yeah. And it also questions the Quranic suggestion that Abraham, Ishmael, and Hagar lived in Mecca, citing other historical accounts placing them mainly in Mesopotamia.
Interesting. What about descriptions of Mecca's environment?
The source argues the Quran describes Mecca with, lush vegetation, fruit, grass, streams. But historically, Mecca's a desert valley, very arid, poor soil. So, a mismatch.
And historical timing. When does Mecca appear in records?
This is another point the source raises. It claims the earliest non-Islamic reference to Mecca is surprisingly late, around AD 741. Meanwhile, other towns nearby pop up in records much earlier.
And its role in trade.
It suggests Mecca wasn't actually a major hub on the ancient trade routes, partly because of its location and elevation compared to other key towns on the Western Plateau that definitely were trade centers.
Okay, but one of the really provocative claims the source makes involves archaeology, doesn't it? Regarding the direction of prayer.
Yes, the Qibla. This is significant in the source's argument. It asserts that the earliest Qiblas we can find from the 7th and early 8th centuries don't actually face Mecca.
They don't. Where do they face?
According to the evidence cited in the source, they face Petra, or possibly Jerusalem, and it claims there's no archaeological evidence of Qiblas facing Mecca until AD 727.
Wow, so the implication is?
The source uses this to suggest that maybe Mecca was chosen as the central holy site later, perhaps in the 8th century, not right at the beginning.
And the Petra connection.
It speculates further, since Petra was this ancient Nabatean religious center dedicated to deities like Dashara, Alat, Aluza, the source suggests that perhaps some Hajj pilgrimage practices were borrowed or adapted from the worship traditions already existing in Petra.
So potentially linking early Islamic practices to existing Arabian pagan traditions via Petra.
That's the connection the source draws from that Qibla evidence. It's definitely a challenging historical reconstruction.
No kidding. Okay, those are some heavy claims about Mecca. Let's move to the book, the Quran. What issues does the source raise there?
It brings up several things. One category is alleged historical anachronisms.
Anachronisms.
Right.
Like things mentioned out of time.
Exactly. For example, it claims the Quran mentions a Samaritan interacting with Moses, but Samaritans as a distinct group emerged much later historically. That's in Quran 20.
Okay, well.
It also mentions crucifixion being discussed in a context, Quran 7, before, the source argues, it was widely used. It points to potential confusion between figures like Pharaoh, Haman, and the Tower of Babel story elements, Quran 28. And it mentions Alexander the Great being depicted more as an engineer building walls, Quran 18, than primarily a military leader.
So the source interprets these as potential historical inaccuracies within the text.
Yes, that's the argument. It then raises what it calls a source material problem.
Meaning where the content came from.
Right. It claims that a lot of material in the Quran seems to parallel or derive from other existing texts, like Jewish apocryphal writings, various Christian sectarian documents, Zoroastrian sources, Ethiopic traditions, even potentially Chinese stories.
And the source uses strong language about this.
It uses the word plagiarism, arguing this borrowing undermines the claim that the Quran is a unique, divinely dictated text straight from Allah.
Okay. What about the physical manuscripts themselves?
This is another area of critique. The source claims that the earliest Quranic manuscripts we have, the ones often dated to the 7th or 8th century, are actually incomplete.
Incomplete.
Yes, and perhaps more importantly, it claims they show variations, they disagree with each other, and they also disagree in places with the standard version of the Quran used today.
So what's the big picture conclusion the source draws from all of these points about the Quran?
Based on its analysis of these alleged anachronisms, source materials, and manuscript variations, the source concludes that the Quran wasn't finalized in the 7th century as traditionally taught.
But rather,
it argues it evolved and was compiled over a longer period, late 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, maybe even later.
and it singles out the Hafs version, the most common one today.
Yes, it claims that even this standard Hafs text disagrees with some 29 other known Arabic versions, and its conclusion from this is pretty blunt.
Which is?
It argues this demonstrates the Quran isn't eternal or perfectly preserved from Allah, nor exactly from Muhammad or Caliph Uthman. Instead, the source presents it as, quote, just another book written, changed, and canonized by mere men over centuries.
That's a fundamental challenge to the Islamic view of the Quran.
Absolutely. It strikes at the heart of its perceived divine nature and immutability.
Okay. Let's turn to the third category. The man, Muhammad. What historical issues does the source raise here?
It makes another striking claim, that there's basically no contemporary historical evidence from coins, documents, rock inscriptions, things like that, that mentions a specific Muslim caliphate or even Muhammad himself during the very earliest period, say AD 622 to 661.
No mention at all in that time frame. So when does the source say clear references do start appearing?
It argues that key Islamic identifiers, like using Bismillah in the name of Allah, on official documents, and crucially, including Muhammad's name in the Shahada Declaration, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, that these were introduced later,
Right.
around AD 691, under the Caliph Abd al-Malik.
And his actions around that time are seen as significant by the source.
Very much so. Around AD 692, he made Arabic the official administrative language, and he introduced what the source calls the first truly Islamic coins.
Coins. What was on them?
Interestingly, the source claims his very first coins might have had his own image on one side and the Shahada on the other, which it suggests could hint at an early ambiguity about who the messenger was. But soon after, by AD 696, the coins changed to purely text the Shahada, Quranic verses.
And where does the source say we find the earliest solid historical evidence for Islam as we know it, including Muhammad as the prophet?
It pinpoints the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed around AD 691-692. It argues this is where we first see the key theological statements and the figure of Muhammad presented in a way that aligns with later Islamic tradition.
So, placing the consolidation and public declaration of Islam significantly later than the traditional start date.
That's the timeline the source constructs based on this interpretation of the evidence, yes.
Okay, so those are the detailed historical, archaeological, textual arguments the source lays out as grounds for challenging the standard Islamic narrative. Quite a lot to take in.
Definitely. And those are the specific lines of reasoning it suggests can be used when engaging, particularly with Muslims who might be open to considering historical evidence.
Right. Now, the chapter makes a big shift, focusing on how to actually use this confrontational approach as a gospel bridge.
Yeah.
It even acknowledges this is debated among Christians, right?
Oh, yeah. It explicitly says some Christians favor less confrontation, more just proclamation. But this source, as we've heard, argues for addressing false beliefs directly. It links it to spiritual warfare against sin, saying people need to see why they need a savior.
And it offers practical principles for doing this. What's the first one?
Principle 1. Discern the type of Muslim you're engaging with.
This seems critical. Know the person, not just the label.
Exactly. The source stresses that these deep historical critiques might not land well or even make sense to an average Muslim who simply grew up in the faith and hasn't studied all this.
Who are they more suited for then?
It suggests this approach is potentially more impactful for Orthodox Muslims, maybe those with more academic or Western-style education who might value historical or textual arguments.
And relationship first.
Absolutely emphasize. Build trust. And again, be acutely aware of the social context, blasphemy laws, persecution risks. The source stresses suffering for Christ, not for being tactless or foolish.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Principle 2.
Confront out of love. This is huge, given the nature of the confrontation being suggested.
How you say it matters more than what you say. Almost.
Well, how you say it is paramount. It quotes 1 Peter 3.15, gentleness and respect. It clarifies this isn't about being weak, but being firm on truth while maintaining a loving attitude.
The source argues telling the truth is the loving thing.
Yes, especially truth leading to salvation. And it stresses checking your own motives constantly. Is it about winning the argument or winning the person for Christ?
And avoiding defensiveness.
Right. Don't retaliate if Christianity is attacked. Follow Jesus' example praying for persecutors.
Okay. Principle 3 sounds interesting. Confront through asking questions.
Yeah, this is presented as much better than just making blunt statements. It fosters dialogue. Instead of Islam is false, ask something like, do you believe it's possible Islam might contain historical inaccuracies?
It encourages them to think rather than just react. What kind of questions does it suggest?
Several examples. One is asking about Muhammad's own stated uncertainty about his salvation.
How does that help?
It highlights the idea of salvation by works in Islam and the resulting lack of assurance, prompting the person to consider their own basis for hope. Another is asking, is Islam truly a religion of peace? Why do extremist groups quote the Quran?
That forces them to grapple with difficult interpretations of their own text.
Exactly. And it also suggests asking about the dignity and value afforded to women in Islam.
Referencing specific verses.
Yes, it lists several verses that it interprets as problematic regarding women related to marital relations, legal status as witnesses, inheritance, temporary marriage, wife beating, dress codes. It suggests linking these questions to the actual concerns or experiences of the Muslim friend, if possible.
Right. And the final principle, number 4.
Confront over issues that make Jesus the better option. This is crucial.
Why? To avoid just tearing down.
Precisely. The goal isn't just to create a vacuum by dismantling their faith, but to positively point them to Jesus. So the questions here are designed to highlight Jesus as a superior answer or hope.
Like comparing Jesus and Muhammad on peace.
Right. Who promoted peace more? It opens the door to share about Jesus' life and teachings, recognizing many Muslims may know very little about the biblical Jesus.
Okay.
Another question. Does Jesus fulfill the criteria many Muslims have for the Word of God being eternal, sent down, complete, unchanged? This contrasts Jesus, the living Word, with the Quran, and clarifies the difference between the biblical Jesus and the Quranic figure Isa.
What about the name Isa itself?
Yeah, asking why the Quran uses Isa instead of Yeshua, which means he saves. This lets you talk about Jesus' core purpose, salvation.
And addressing apparent contradictions.
Like questioning the Quran's seeming contradiction about whether Jesus actually died, comparing Q2 4.157 with Q 19.33. This naturally leads to explaining why Christians believe Jesus died for atonement.
And deeper theological questions.
Yes, like probing the implications of fatalism in Islam. If Allah controls everything, is he responsible for sin? Or the fundamental question, how can any person with even one sin stand before a perfectly holy God?
Contrasting the answers.
Exactly. Contrasting the Islamic hope in Allah's mercy hopefully outweighing sins versus the Christian answer of Jesus' righteousness covering our sin, his death paying the penalty. It aims to show the need for a savior and present Jesus as the unique solution, offering assurance, like 1 John 5.33 mentions.
So bringing this all together for you, the listener, this chapter from Imara really maps out a specific, and you could say quite assertive, strategy for engaging with Muslims.
It argues strongly for using direct intellectual challenge, finding its justification in its reading of biblical examples like Jesus and Paul.
And it equips this approach with a whole set of detailed historical and textual claims aimed at critically examining core Muslim beliefs about Mecca, the Quran, and Muhammad's origins.
But, and this is a huge but, in the chapter, it insists that this must be done carefully, with discernment about the person and context, grounded in relationship, motivated by genuine love.
Delivered primarily through thoughtful questions, not just attacks, and always aiming to point people towards Jesus Christ as the better, truer answer.
It's definitely a distinct method, laid out here with specific tactics for anyone considering this kind of confrontational yet hopefully loving engagement.
So we've done our deep dive into Chapter 15 of Imara on confrontation. We look at the source's case for a biblical basis, and we explored those detailed critiques at levels against traditional Islamic history concerning Mecca, the Quran, and Muhammad.
And importantly, we covered the principles it insists must guide this approach. The absolute necessity of love, careful discernment, using questions wisely, and making sure the ultimate focus remains on Jesus.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to wrestle with, based on everything this source presents. It advocates using some very sharp historical and textual critiques against foundational beliefs. Yet it simultaneously demands this critique be delivered with gentleness and respect, driven by love. What does it actually look like in a real conversation to hold those two things together, that intense critique and that deep compassion, when discussing beliefs that are so central to someone's life and identity?